Tonight's a great night because we've got a very special treat for you. We have someone who spent a number of years at Richard Nixon's side. And remember that when he lost the two elections, the presidential in 1962, the gubernatorial in 1960, in 60, and the gubernatorial in 1962, people wrote him off. They said, Richard Nixon is gone. He said, this is my last press conference. Not so. At about the same time, a young man left Columbia University, graduated from Columbia, joined the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, became an editorial writer, and along the way he met Richard Nixon. And that began a magnificent journey. It began a magic carpet ride from Richard Nixon's defeat through years of what Richard Nixon described as the wilderness years to the achievement of the highest office in the world, President of the United States. And Pat Buchanan was with him every step of the way. And it's recorded in this great book that was just launched last week. In fact, this is the Pacific Coast launch of it. The greatest comeback of how Richard Nixon built the new majority and the silent majority and how he won the presidency. So here's a man who spent every day with him, strategizing, planning, creating, and he's a first-hand eyewitness to the magnificent brilliance of the 37th president. Please welcome Pat Buchanan.
Thank you very much, Sandy. With that reception, I may start looking at 2016. You know, I always relish coming back here. This is the second time I guess I've spoken in the East Room of the Nixon Library, and it is a magnificent and memorable place. You know, I was going to mention all the folks I've served with over the years, and even going back 4 and 5 decades, and I'd like to single out one who was with Richard Nixon for the campaign of 1960 before I was there, the campaign for governor in 62 before I was there, and who rode with Richard Nixon on that plane around trying to save Barry Goldwater in 1964 before I was there. And that's Shelley Buchanan. You want to stand up, Shelley? She was Shelley Scarney then, as I recall. I'd also like to say a couple of words about Sandy Quinn, who I got to know Richard Nixon up in New York when I first went to work for him. Told me, Pat, when you get to Washington, there's 3 people you want to see, and Sandy Quinn, Bill Stover, and Agnes Waldron, who had been old friends and loyalists of a long time. And Sandy has done a magnificent job for the foundation and everything, and I know you heard him tonight, and I really think he deserves more than one round of applause. You know, and the greatest comeback is not definitive history of that period, but what it is a memoir of my time and those 3 years with Richard Nixon before he became president. And it is the story of a man who rose from one of the worst defeats in American political history and the worst occasions, and came back from basically a broken career to lead a shattered and ruined party not only to victory in 1968, but to create a great coalition that succeeded FDR's coalition and dominated the presidency for 20 of the next 24 years. I've often told friends that what Richard Nixon did in the 20th century is matched only by one other man, that's FDR, who created that coalition which dominated the White House, I guess if you exclude Eisenhower, for 7 of 9 presidencies after 1932. Let me tell you a little bit then and go back and try to tell some of this story as much as I can do in the limited time we have available. The first words I heard from the President of the United States were these: "Buchanan, was that you throwing the eggs?" He had just been inaugurated, delivered his inaugural speech, was coming up Pennsylvania Avenue, and his limousine was showered with debris and rocks and eggs and everything, and he showed up at the White House, and he was going into the reviewing stand, and Shelley and I were walking into the reviewing stand along these boards that the Secret Service had put down because it was so muddy. And I heard behind me the Secret Service saying, "Could you step off the boards, sir?" So I stepped off the boards, and in walks the President of the United States, and that's what he said: "Buchanan, was that you throwing the eggs?" But let me go back, really, and that incident, incidentally, is a metaphor for the city Richard Nixon came into. He was the first president since Zachary Taylor to take over the White House with both houses of the Congress in opposition. The media either loathed or detested Richard Nixon by and large. The bureaucracy had been built up in the New Deal, the Fair Deal, and the Great Society, and was overwhelmingly Democratic. It was a hostile city that Richard Nixon came into that had just broken the presidency of Lyndon Baines Johnson, who, after winning a magnificent landslide in '64, had stood down in 1968. That was the America, basically, of madmen, if you will. The America that we saw on that film, Mad Men. Take a look at what happened in those years before I got to meet Richard Nixon. 1963, we had John F. Kennedy assassinated. In 1964, you had the first uprising at Berkeley of the great campus disorders of the 1960s. This was the beginning, if you will, of the revolution. In 1965, folks out here will remember the Watts riot, the worst race riot of its time since the Civil War. You had the beginning of the revolution. You know, I was a young man. I was an editorial writer at the Globe Democrat in St. Louis. I drove back to Washington to hear Martin Luther King deliver his famous speech in the Lincoln Memorial. I was up in the memorial with him. It was a magnificent moment. 1 year later, 50 years ago this month, I was in Neshoba County, Mississippi, before they found the bodies of the 3 civil rights workers. And the civil rights revolution of those days, which had started off so well, was rapidly disintegrating into disorder and riots and Black Power and Black Panthers and all the rest of it. That was the world we came into. Now let's take a look at what Nixon himself was in that period. You know, people talk about 62 and 64, and they're correct. But you go all the way back to 1950. That was the last election that Richard Nixon won in his own right. He won a landslide, the biggest victory California had ever seen, over Helen Gahagan Douglas. When he won with Eisenhower, but Eisenhower could have been elected on any ticket. But 1954, when Nixon was leading the Republican Party lost both houses of Congress. They lost 13 Senate seats in 1958. 1960, he lost narrowly in a contested election, maybe a stolen election, to Jack Kennedy. We know what happened. We all heard of what happened in Chicago and in Texas. 62, he came out and ran for governor and was defeated by Governor Pat Brown. Then he had that famous press conference where he just said, this is it. He'd had it with the press. He said, think of all the fun you're going to be missing. You won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore. Because, folks,